Woo, it's smoky in here. Good afternoon. Maybe in a few minutes I can see you. Good afternoon. Hackers, geeks, friends, and everyone with an interest in the world of cybersecurity. It's an honor to be here. So one of the very first conferences of the year, and it's called Disobey. Now in some cultures, like mine, there's a belief that whatever you may be doing, the first few things that you do at the beginning of the year will define what you will be mostly doing for the rest of the year. Who among you here has Disobey as their first conference? Wow, me too. With this much people having disobedience as their theme, don't you like where this year is heading already? For those who don't know me, my background in cybersecurity is in cyber defense. So I joined the antivirus industry in 2003 because I thought that fighting against malware was cool and heroic. And I wasn't wrong. So back then, like Spider-Man, I was young, broke, but a superhero. It's a fun gig. And I was working as a malware analyst, reversing compiled portable executable codes, typically for the Windows operating system. And I was doing that for several years until the amount of malware vastly increased. And so did the need to automate. So I had a stint shortly as a developer of Honey client systems as well. And then 11 years ago, I joined F-Secure, where I became a malware analyst once again. So how long is that? 16 years. So 16 years in this industry. 16 years. I must have learned something, right? I mean, I hope I did. So beyond the highs of reversing a nasty PE packer that refuses to be reversed and you ace it, or finding a never-before-seen malware in your honeypot when you get to the office in the morning. What have I really accomplished? These were the thoughts that I was thinking to myself while I was invited here and thinking, what should I tell these people? And then I began to realize that these are questions that people who are having a midlife crisis ask themselves. And you don't want me to have a midlife crisis on stage, right? So I started thinking bigger. What have we in the cybersecurity community accomplished in our defiance, in our disobedience, in pushing back against organizations that were seemingly unwilling to change? Have we really made a dent? In our community, we focus on issues a lot. There's a bug here, there's a vulnerability there, and look, there's now a malware exploiting this bug. I knew it. I've been talking about this bug for years, and nobody was listening to me. These sentiments, they're not uncommon in Twitter. And they do have a point. But sometimes, maybe we just failed to see that some of the message that we have been saying has already come across. And we have already managed to raise the bar of digital security. Now, throughout our careers here, we will be meeting different personas. Some of them will be faceless and nameless. And some of them, they could be your colleagues or the people beside you. And some of them may be you. For instance, many among you here are probably white hats, performing penetration testing in organizations, recommending solutions, or trying to do vulnerability testing against applications. and reporting those to organizations who can do something about it. Or some of you, like me, could be defenders, building endpoint protection systems, building VPN software, encryption software, IT security perhaps, or SOC, CERT. These are the people who try to create defenses to protect an organization against an attack. And there are those who we often work with, platform owners who build the operating systems, who build the banking systems, the different platforms where users interact with. And the one thing that they have in common is that they own the code where we find these vulnerabilities. And for some, it's the government. What can I say about the government? Well, like platform owners, we do have a love-hate relationship with the government. And more recently, we are working closely with them. But there are also times that, we have kind of friction with the government. And then lastly, cyber criminals. So these can range from misguided people to all-out underground crime syndicates. And the one thing that they have in common is that they only really think of themselves. They don't care if their actions makes victims out of people. And these different personas, they help elevate the bar of digital security. And today, as is customary during beginnings of the year, let's take a trip back in time and see how these different personas have helped elevate the game and how we have managed to raise the bar of digital security. First up, disclosures. A very flammable topic in the cybersecurity community. Well, before the bug track mailing list was created, vulnerabilities were passed around between a close group of hackers, security researchers, software engineers, and whatever they did with these vulnerabilities, we don't really know. Because during this time, they were not sharing this information. They just kept it among their circle. This was the time of non-disclosure. And since there was no publicity, there was the problem was not really visible. Problem was hidden. And during this time, platform owners didn't have any incentive to fix the problem because it felt like it wasn't really up there. For the cyber criminals, this was beneficial because they could use these exploits for personal gain. But for the white hats who wanted to elevate the state of our digital security, this was very frustrating because however they tried screaming that there was a problem, well, virtually nobody was listening. And so this frustration led to the birth of discussions on how we can involve more people who can actually do something about it. How we can involve administrators, perhaps. And from these discussions, the pendulum swung to the other end of the spectrum and gave birth to the full disclosure movement. So full disclosure, bug track mailing list. So bug track was created in 1993 and it was the poster child of the full disclosure movement. Bug track at that time, it contained everything vulnerability related, from how to exploit the vulnerability, new tools written to exploit this vulnerability, mitigations against this vulnerability. Suddenly, all of this information was now available to a wider audience. Both the administrator and the script kiddie now had access to the same information that they can use either to defend or to initiate an attack. Now, to say that the full disclosure movement caused headaches to the platform owners was an understatement. Because at this time, there were patches that have been released for months, even years, that have not yet been applied. And having an exploit for some of these vulnerabilities was like having a loaded gun out in the public for anyone to use. And during this time, the malware landscape shifted. So malware slowly stopped being file infectors and propagating via removable drives to network worms and automatically propagating via the network. And it didn't help that during this time, more and more people were staying online much longer. Code Red was one of these early 2000 worms, and it was a fileless, was an automatically network spreading worm, and it caused headaches to the cyber defense industry. At the time, we didn't really have a lot of memory or network scanners. We had file-based scanners. So we had to elevate our security in the sense that we now had to introduce protections both for the memory and for the network. In Scott Culp's essay in 2001, he mentioned that malware such as Code Red are rightly attributed to criminals. And yes, they should be called criminals, but they needed help to devastate our systems. And we, in the cybersecurity community, gave it to them. Scott Culp was the manager of the Microsoft Security and Response Center. So this is the division of Microsoft that's handling vulnerabilities to their products. And they have felt the brunt of the attack. Now, on the flip side, the full disclosure movement also said that because there is now a sense of urgency that administrators need to patch these vulnerabilities, they should be immediately going out there and patching them. So the movement will help with that. And while both sides do have good points, both sides are also painfully aware that in the wrong hands, exploits to these vulnerabilities have very costly consequences. However pain the full disclosure movement caused, it was necessary to give birth to a middle ground, which we call many names, but I'll call it responsible disclosure. So after Scott Culp's essay was published, Microsoft and a few other vendors, they met together and formed the Responsible Disclosure Forum, where they now tried to define guidelines on how white hats and platform owners would approach this in a more coordinated manner. And nowadays, it has evolved to like different incarnations of our coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes. And during this time, what was interesting as well is that the market for vulnerabilities has evolved. And there are organizations such as the Zero Day Initiative that came into the picture to capitalize on this market. And for white hats who wanted to earn on their research, there was suddenly a platform available for this. For example, if you reported a novel exploit with ZDI, they would then do responsible disclosure with the platform owners where this is targeted for. So it provided an avenue where some of those white hats who were actually feeling that they don't want to report these things straight to the platform owners because it feels like extortion, there was now a middle ground for them to do it. But today, bug bounties, they are increasingly becoming common. And now there is already a sense of pride associated with reporting a novel vulnerability to a platform owner. Microsoft has shown the report that they have for the past decade, where the amount of vulnerabilities that have actually been reported to them has significantly increased. But the amount of vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild has been decreasing. And another point for bug bounties is that this year, European Union has announced that they will support bounties for free and open source software. which is actually quite great. Now, what's happening here? We have now removed the false sense of security that people have been feeling in the past. We have now reached an understanding with the platform owners. We have raised the bar towards a more responsible software development process. And we have helped make bug bounties commonplace while lessening the exposure of these dangerous exploits to cyber criminals. These things are something that you can feel very good about. So, blast from the past. Code Red, Sasser, Blaster, Slammer. What do these malware have in common? Anyone, so that I don't feel like a dinosaur. Come on. Sorry? Yes, correct. These are worms, indeed. People here are a bit shy. Okay, I'll just continue. So, these are worms, definitely, from early 2000s. Collectively, they cost billions of dollars of damages. And well, they were network propagating on their own. And they use buffer overflows to do it. Now, 2003, that was an exciting time for me to start my career in the antivirus industry because there was one outbreak after another. And I remember a time when I was in the Philippines, in the 14th floor of a building. We had a case, and there was an earthquake. So, building was shaking. I looked around to my colleagues who were also looking around, and then we looked at the ceiling, and then went back to our computers. Nobody went down. And thinking about that now, it sounds a little bit silly, right? But I guess our sense of danger then was a little bit warped because malware that was spreading to tens of thousands of computers seemed more dangerous than some tremor. So we stayed there, but I am really glad that that building was well built. But why were these malware so effective then? Why were they heavily using buffer overflows? During this time, the operating system had virtually no protection for the stack or the heap. You can push your code, point your execution pointer there, and then you can have your code getting executed in the stack. So with this type of operating system, at that time, all of memory was virtually executable space. And of course, at this time, there were worms that came along, such as Blaster. Blaster was challenging Microsoft. That why was Microsoft helping making it possible for them to do it? And on the flip side, Microsoft was trying to release one patch after another for these buffer overflow vulnerabilities. And although their actions were heroic, it didn't really address the core of the problem because the design was flawed. But little did we know that apparently behind the scenes, something was already cooking. And in 2004, AMD and Intel announced the no execute bit, where this time you can have both the hardware and the operating system cooperate in order to protect certain regions of memory and render them non-executable. And Windows, of course, who was the recipient of a bunch of this malware, introduced the data execution prevention. But other operating systems, they also introduced this kind of protections as well. So Mac has the WZOR-X protection. And for Android, it has a non-executable stack and heap. But since Windows was the malware favorite because of its prevalence, then in the next Black Hat conferences, there were now presentations of how do you bypass the NX bit? And of course, they bypassed the NX bit. And then eventually Microsoft had to introduce address space layout randomization, safe as EH. And in 2013, they introduced the mitigation, bypass, and bounty for defense terms, where all of these different functionalities in the operating system, which is used purely for defense, you find a bug, a vulnerability on them, you can report it against that bounty program. Today, worms that are able to propagate on the same level as those of the early 2000s is a rare occurrence. But are they gone? In 2017, WannaCry came. And WannaCry was able to bypass the NX bit, all of these other protections, and propagate on the network on the same magnitude as these early 2000 worms. Now, why did this happen? Well, WannaCry was using an exploit that was designed by a government agency, and this exploit enabled them to perform that level of propagation. So if you can see, in the early 2000s, almost anybody with access, with interest, could create these kind of exploits. And today, it takes a government agency to perform that level of propagation. The bar for successfully using these network buffer overflows for propagating your worms is now much higher. But what else do we have then? Aside from an unprotected memory space, what else is there? How about an unprotected kernel, where you have drivers that can affect each other and drivers that can affect the kernel itself? In the late 1990s to early 2000s, malware rootkits came into the picture. And although these are not as prevalent as your typical user mode malware, they were still causing some headaches because they were slightly different. For example, there was a rootkit called Hacker Defender that was able to hide files, registry entries, processes. Because who wouldn't be seduced by the idea of hiding your malware from the operating system? For example, if you hid behind a file system driver, you can tell the operating system that you don't exist. You can tell other processes, including your antivirus software, that you don't exist. And of course, in the cyber defense, it became apparent that we needed to evolve our protections in order to defend against this type of threat. And so there were solutions such as sysinternal's rootkit revealer or F-Secure's Blacklight that was released during that time to address this problem. In 2005, Sony BMG released CDs that had digital copyright protection on them called extended copy protection. And what these CDs had was that they had a music, of course. They had a music player. And then when you were playing, it silently installed a rootkit into your system. And what this rootkit did was that it limited what the users can do with their CDs, including, of course, copying the music out. But what's really nasty with this rootkit is that if you are building files of a certain file format, this rootkit will hide that as well. And when cyber criminals learned about this, guess what they did? They built malware that hid behind the Sony BMG rootkit. And of course, this caused a public outcry that caused the US government to file a lawsuit against Sony BMG. And they had to suspend their copy protection 2 years later. But during this time as well, Windows has introduced the kernel patch protection, or Windows Patch Guard. And this was the beginning of the operating system trying to address this threat. Starting Windows 10 Redstone 1, you can no longer install kernel mode drivers that have not been validated, that have not been approved in the Microsoft Hardware Center Dev Portal, which means that as a vendor, as a publisher of this driver, you need to be vetted by the Microsoft Hardware Dev Center, and then you also need to have an extended validation code signing certificate. So there's now the validation coming from the publisher and the validation coming from Microsoft to verify if a kernel mode driver can really run on the OS. And a bit more recently, Microsoft also introduced the early load anti-malware functionality, where if you're a security vendor, your driver could load before other third-party drivers, thereby giving you the opportunity to scan these other drivers before they load. And beyond Windows, Mac has also introduced the concept of notarizations, where your kernel extensions could now be notarized so that your users can have a seamless experience with a gatekeeper. But mobile platforms, they're an even better success story because they managed to design security at the beginning. By default, they have application sandboxes where by default the apps won't be able to affect each other. And they have limited access to the operating system as well. The learnings have gone beyond the desktop operating systems. Now we are able to design operating systems with security in mind. So the bar for subverting the kernel is much higher than before. There was also a time when encrypted traffic was an anomaly. If you had a Facebook account and then you logged into through a network, and then you also have, let's say, instant messenger chats with your friends. That's what we called it then, instant messaging. All your traffic is clear text over the network. Now, you would have thought that I'm talking about something that happened decades ago. But this was less than 10 years ago. Less than 10 years ago. Where all somebody has to do, if they want to grab your Facebook credentials, for instance, is be on the same network with you and have some random sniffer. And it wasn't hard to be in a network with a stranger because coffee shops at that time were starting to offer free Wi-Fi. So the threat of session hijacking is very real. And there were tools such as Fireship that came into the picture and helped attackers acquire session cookies and assume them. Banks, as a group, they were the very first to use HTTPS. And rightfully so, because their users have the most to lose in case of these types of attacks. But it didn't end there, because websites that were processing credentials followed suit. And Facebook in 2011 announced that they were using HTTPS. But it didn't end there, because nowadays, even websites that don't process credentials, they are using HTTPS as well. They have now understood somehow that if you're reading some news or searching something via your search engines, and somebody on the same network knows what you're doing, that's already a privacy breach. And there are browsers nowadays that are supporting this move. For example, Chrome. If you visit a website in Chrome that is an HTTP website, it will call the website not secure. And this attaches a stigma to the website, hoping that they would encrypt their traffic. And probably it's working because Google shared their numbers regarding the amount of HTTPS traffic in different Chrome browsers, in different operating systems. And as of a few days ago, the lowest one is in Linux. And even that is 70% in HTTPS. This is quite admirable. Less than 10 years. And of course, while we don't want to diminish this accomplishment, there is one part of our traffic that is still at the very core unencrypted. And this is DNS resolution. And even with new versions of operating systems such as Android Pie, where it already has private DNS, the server name identification part is still in clear text. So whoever's in the same network with you will at least know which domains you're going to. And this is why solutions like VPN are still very useful in order to give you a full cloak of confidentiality. So this should be VPN with DNS leak protection. And then, of course, it has been advised over and over again that if you have more secure communication, use PGP. Although we haven't yet reached a time when all of our traffic is really protected, all of it is encrypted, we hope that one day, the parties that will be able to view our traffic are only those for whom it's intended for. At least we hope. Because one of the most powerful players, one of the most powerful personas in this game, has taken an interest in global mass surveillance. 5 years ago, Edward Snowden shocked the world with his revelations that the NSA is spying on foreign traffic. Now, in a world where most of our services are actually located in the US, most of our traffic is fair game to the NSA. And this caused an outcry around that time, but how fast do people forget? Because last year, when projects Prism and Upstream were pushed to the Congress for renewal, they passed with little difficulty. And a week later, US President Donald Trump approved them to law. And this was valid for the next 6 years. Raising the bar doesn't mean that we won't encounter those with seemingly unlimited budgets who will stop at nothing to get your information. But it means that we are able to weed out the weaker opponents so that we can focus on the more advanced ones. And this is where you can truly test your disobedience. Because if you have an opponent that is this powerful, heavily resourced, seemingly unlimited resource, would you still continue fighting? Or would you give up? But there are times that the government can remind us that they can also be on our side. So in the recent years, there's one topic after another of one of the recent threats that we have seen to our privacy and security, which are breaches. And since 2013, we have seen one breach after another. So 2013 and 2014, we have seen the Yahoo breaches, which compromised 1 billion credentials. 2014, there was eBay. 2015, there was a website for extramarital affairs that was breached called Ashley Madison. And what happened was that its users was dumped for public consumption. And while breaches of websites like Ashley Madison is damaging to some people's reputations and marriages, There are breaches that are just plain damaging. In 2017, we have seen the Equifax breach. And this affected 150 million people. And what was compromised was their full names, social security numbers, addresses, dates of birth, and for some, even their driver's licenses. It doesn't take much to go from there to identity theft. And Equifax was quite notorious. It was the single most cause of a spike of the search breaches in the last 5 years, so the search for the word breach. And that spike coincided around the time that Equifax divulged to the public that they have been compromised. So the people were concerned. And of course, they wanted the problem addressed. And there are some government agencies in the US, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which actually rose up and filed lawsuits against Equifax on behalf of the people. And then IRS as well canceled their multi-million-dollar contracts with Equifax. And these things, they are very, very good to show support for your citizens. But nowhere is it more visible than in the European Union that the government is actually listening and caring about its people's privacy. Because last year, the GDPR starts to be enforced. And this is the single most law with the widest coverage when it comes to protecting our information that's stored on someone else's servers. Article 33 of the GDPR states that if you have had a breach and it affected users' credentials or potentially affected users' information, you are required to report within 72 hours to the authorities and to include remedial actions taken. So now the government is holding these organizations accountable for our data. And they need to do their due diligence in protecting our data. But what is really a good mitigation against breaches? Many of you here do offensive security for a living. So you're white hats. You try to do penetration testing in organizations, and then you show them where are the weak points, give them recommendations for hardening their systems or their networks. These recommendations, coupled with the solutions that our defenders have built, are the best defenses that we can have against these type of threats. In this time and age where the Internet of Things is going to the same networks as our endpoint devices, even if platform owners such as Microsoft, Apple, or Google try to publish their best practices and try to really push it out there so that others copy it, perhaps, some of these new organizations, these new platform owners, may not yet be listening. But look at that. We're not alone in our advocacy anymore. These platform owners, which are actually quite big platform owners, are now advocating with us. Apple now has more and more topics in WWDC that are related to security. And Microsoft, they have Blue Hat conferences, virus initiative programs, and they even partner with Pwn2Own. It's not us versus them anymore. Most of the time, I'm saying most of the time, we are now speaking the same security language. If that is not an accomplishment, then I don't know what is. But what does this mean for us now? Does this mean that our job is done, we just go home because, they have already been convinced? Of Of course not. It is only through advocacy that we don't backslide, because as we continue raising the bar, so are the cyber criminals raising theirs. And we also have new platform owners who are coming into the picture, who are all about functionality and securities and inconvenience. What do you do then? You find a vulnerability in their product, they don't have a bug bounty. You try to find a contact, you can't find anyone. And because you so religiously tried, you finally found one. And then you sent an email, and then they ignore you and hope you go away. What do you do? Gets painful sometimes, right? Do you just give up? Feels like history repeating itself, perhaps? It may be. But remember that these are now different organizations. Different organizations, different platform owners that we can bring to the right side of history. Because can you imagine, if we didn't continue our advocacy then, can you imagine what Windows would look like today? Raising the bar it's a team game. And this is the boat that we have to ride together. To grab a page from Rainforest Puppy. This was the first white hat who dared to draft a disclosures guideline. Let us stop pointing fingers and just fix the problem. There are those who disobeyed and left chaos in their wake. There were also those who disobeyed only for personal gain at the expense of others. But there were those who disobeyed and changed the world for the better. Disobey wisely. Thank you. Do we take questions here? I don't know. We take questions, all right?
Okay, thanks for the talk.
Yes.
There was this, you used the term responsible disclosure, and that's highly controversial.
Yes.
Because if we think about the situation when everything was wide open exploitable in the 90s or early 2000s, and then what kind of capabilities people like nation states had at the time, and then there were actually people, or there are actually people whose lives can be depended on their computer security and so forth. And if we think about that, those people don't know that their systems are vulnerable, is that a bigger problem than just some malware running around and maybe destroying some random people's computers who don't have actually their lives online or anything like that? Or how you would weigh these kind of things?
So your question is related to, is
information asymmetry, basically. So I think now it's on much, we are on much better grounds with that right now than we were then. And then people's threat models are a little bit different.
That is true. During the time, the problem was really that since the platform owners were also not on the side of security, they were even part of the problem. That even if there was a problem, they were part of kind of hiding the problem or minimizing the problem. But since that is not the case anymore today, then you are right in saying that it has really improved. But if your question regarding which is a bigger problem, the malware that is running around or the exposure of the problem. So in both sides, the problem is still there, but the exploitation of the problem has not happened with that which didn't have the malware running around. Sorry?
You don't know.
Well, yeah, I didn't know. So, for example, when you know, then you would know that those that are exploited are clearly the ones that have been affected. But since Stuxnet times, we already know that there are things that we never really knew that was happening behind the scenes. Did that address some of your thoughts? Probably, okay. We can talk later as well. Anyone else? Yes.
Moi, what do you think of mobile phone networks as platform providers and the security?
Mobile phone networks, not
Yeah.
mobile phones.
Not yet really the networks, because I say they're communication providers.
It depends what we're talking about, like which communication, because if you're talking, let's say, text or SMS, that's on a network that is completely unencrypted, which is, I think you already know that it's not very good. So let's say there is, I'll give you a scenario, for example, you interface with your bank and you have one-time passwords that are sent to you via SMS. That is quite easy to sort of like, what is the term? To hijack in between. So somebody can actually take your one-time password because the SS7 network that they have is not really encrypted. But that aside, if we're talking about networks that are like now fully encrypted as well, once we're using for 4G, etc., then it is getting closer to the level of our normal network that we use every day, for example, in our offices or in our homes. So it depends like which ones we are talking about, because they kind of provide different platforms as well.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
Thanks for the talk.
Yes.
I remember this story some time ago. There was this guy who made a worm that was going to IoT devices and fixed known vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And there was this reaction on the internet that was quite interesting. They were calling him a hero and all these kind of words. So what is the, how are governments, security companies, antivirus and those kind of companies, how do they see these kind of people? So this is a new form of malware. You cannot even call it a malware, but how are these guys viewed today in the security community? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, this type of malware, they're not entirely new. There were some already in the earlier times that actually, when it installs into the system, it cleans all the other malware. So there were even times that we were thinking that, why don't we just use as a cleanup tool? We execute this malware and then, we take it away in the end because it cleans so much more than if we do it individually. But still, the part of the malware that really makes it malicious is that it installs on your machine without your consent and doing things that you may not really want it to do. So this consent part is one of the biggest things that we have. And for example, if this malware, if it only executes, patches, and then goes away, doesn't clog the networks, that might be a benevolent malware, but most of them, they kind of stick around as well. And the more, like for example, in IoT devices, the more they continue deploying, the more they clog the networks, especially if there's a lot of these devices that are really unpatched. So they still create this level of damage. Yeah. There was one more question here, somewhere.
Hi.
Hi, you're not allowed to ask a question. No,
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
you were referring to how more and more encryption is essentially a good thing for the internet. What's your view on the backlash that's coming from the governments in that regard? We're seeing more and more environments where end-to-end encrypted protocols are actually being blocked. They're being censored by governments. And there is calls even in Western countries to actually implement backdoors.
If you want my personal view or the stage view, well, personally, I am not for the government going on it. I do know that they would like to secure their nations. They would like to secure basically their areas of jurisdiction against this. But I think that communication, like the mere fact that if we cannot be private anymore in our communication, in our thoughts, because a lot of the things that we do online is reflective of who we are. A lot of the things that you search online, that reflects like what your interests are. And if everyone is privy to this information, if the government can profile me, then I don't know, like what is the next step? Will it be minority report level kind of thing where they would be knowing anymore? I mean, already, like based on my behavior, what will I do tomorrow? So personally, I am not really for it. I think it's a step towards something that's going to become just a little bit more dangerous for us as citizens through time. And we are done. Yes. All right, thank you for your questions and thank you for your time.